Florida Medical Association, helping physicians practice medicine.
Welcome to the Medicine Curated podcast. I'm your host, Tim Stapleton, CEO of the Florida Medical Association. Today, we're going to talk about how the state legislative process works. And this should be a very enlightening conversation because our guest is none other than Chris Clark. Chris is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at the FMA, which is really just a fancy way of saying that he oversees the state legislative and political operations for the FMA. Prior to joining our staff at the FMA and taking over as the FMA's chief lobbyist, Chris held several important positions in state government, both in the executive branch, where he served in the administration of Governor Jeb Bush, and in the legislative branch, where he worked for Senator Don Gates. His work in the Florida Senate included serving as the chief of staff to the Senate president. There are really only a handful of people in Tallahassee who have the kind of experience and knowledge that Chris Clark has accumulated over 25 years of working really at the highest level of state government in Florida. So welcome to the podcast, Chris. I'd like to start by having you give our audience an overview of the Florida State Legislature. For example, basic stuff. How many legislators are there in the House and Senate? How long are their terms in office? And tell us when they meet and how often they meet.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, man. Thank you so much. It's a great opportunity. The Florida Legislature is made out of, made up of two branches: the House of Representatives and the Senate. Our House of Representatives is represented by 120 members that each represent a district of about 160,000 voters. And they're up every 2 years. They run every 2 years for election with the term limits of 8 years. And then we have 40 senators that make up the Florida Senate, and they represent districts of about 470,000 people. And those members are up. They run every 4 years. The odd numbers run in presidential years, and the even number of members run in gubernatorial years. But they run, and they usually, there's a 8-year max term limit for them. But because of the fact that half is up every other term, with term limits, some of the districts end up with 10 years versus 8 years.
So, how often does the legislature meet? I know that they're in session for 60 days, but there's a lot more that goes into that, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, the legislature meets in off-election years. The legislative session starts in March. It's a 60-day session that runs through the beginning of May. But in those years, they usually start doing committee hearings the previous December, January, and February. They'll have several committee weeks leading in to the session starting in March. In the election year, they've moved the legislative session back to begin the first week in January. So in the election year, it runs from January for 60 days to the beginning of March, which pushes those committee meetings into September, October, November, and December of the previous year.
Okay, you mentioned term limits a minute ago. Tell us about term limits and how does that work?
Well, our state passed term limits in 1994, which limits House and senators from serving 8 years in their respective chambers. And so when this happened, the House members can run for 4 consecutive terms to make up their 8 years. The senators, because the half run in gubernatorial years and the other half run in presidential years, depending on their odd or even numbers, some, and when they get elected, if they get elected to a 2-year term, and then they serve, 2 4-year terms, they can actually get 10 total years in there. And what this is term limits have really, it really has affected a push for members to run for higher office. And you see also running for other offices that's always in play. Whereas before there were term limits, you would see members serve for, 10, 12, 20 years in the House of Representatives with no desire to look for running for the Senate or running for other offices. They were content to represent their House district, and they served and moved up the chain of command in the House. But with term limits, you start to see a much more of a movement from House members getting elected, immediately looking for what Senate opportunities there would be. And then you have both House and senators looking at what congressional opportunities are opening up. And then you have all of them also looking for statewide offices in the cabinet, where it be the governor, attorney general, CFO, or ag commissioner. So it's a constant churn of looking for higher office.
So, that's interesting. So we've been operating basically for about, a little over 20 years now with term limits. And what that means is we always have a significant turnover in legislative seats, every 2 years. What does this mean for advocacy organizations such as the Florida Medical Association? How does that affect our operations?
Well, it both has good and bad aspects of it. Again, whenever you have a really good crop of legislative leaders, where you have a lot of physicians that have, personal relationships with them, they are limited to serving, just the 8 years in the House or the 8 to 10 years in the Senate. But also the upside to that is if you have particularly bad legislators or a bad crop, they kind of come and go rather quickly. So again, the upside to that is you're always looking to establish relationships and build relationships for now and into the future. But also, it's an ever-changing body, so you really can't afford to take any election cycle off. And while you may have had a successful election cycle 4 years ago, where we had a lot of doctors involved building relationships, every cycle those people shift out. We see them running for Congress, which is very beneficial for our association and physicians. But you'll also see them transfer to run for local office, whether it be tax collector or property appraiser. So while that doesn't necessarily help advance our cause, so it has both good and bad impacts. But the one thing that's certain is there's always opportunities.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. A lot of people talk about term limits in a negative way, and some people talk about them in a positive way. And I don't really want to get into that debate. I don't really have a strong feeling one way or another. We deal with the rules as they exist, and so I think it's fair to say that the high turnover rate that is created by term limits really does create opportunities, particularly for physicians to build relationships, and you alluded to that. And probably even before they get elected is probably more important. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, again, as members get elected and move up in leadership and accumulate more power in the process, obviously more and more people want to get to know them. And there's still plenty of opportunity to get to know your legislator as they move up through the process of legislative leadership. But again, where you really can make a difference is when they're running for that first time. And especially if they're running in a contested primary where you can actually go out and meet candidates, and you can actually help teach them about healthcare and about our issues and physician issues and educate them on that. You're able to help them financially. You're able to help open the door to your network of friends. You're able to walk precincts for them. But again, if you have that opportunity to meet these members the first time they run for office in a primary, and then also if they're in a contested general election and you're there to continue helping them, those are relationships that you build, that you forge, that really carry the weight of, as decisions come through, when someone brings up an idea that's anti-physician or pro-physician, the first thing you have those members thinking about is, what is Dr. So-and-so back home going to think about this? And really, the more we can have our physicians have those relationships built locally for really not a great deal of financial support, or really a great deal of time, but it's a small financial investment, a small time investment into those members as they're running for that first time. There's nothing like that, as we move forward and look at how things are going to happen in the future. So again, with term limits, there's a tremendous opportunity for our physicians to build those relationships and to continue building those relationships every election cycle. As the members move up, they remember who was there in the beginning.
Well, let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about that upward progression that some legislators make. And I want you to think a little bit about your time when you were chief of staff in the Senate President's office. Tell us a little bit about how term limits have impacted the leadership process in Florida. We have a Senate President, we have a House Speaker, Tell us, about that process. How long do they serve? I know, I come from Illinois, and prior to coming down to Florida, we have a House Speaker in Illinois that has served in that position for almost 30 years. So he has tremendous, I think he's the longest serving presiding officer of any state legislature in the country. But Florida is very different. Every 2 years, we get a new Senate president, we get a new House Speaker. Tell us about that a little bit, and how term limits have impacted that process.
Well, it really, again, we have a turnover in our leadership every 2 years in both the Senate and in the House. And used to, members would serve an indefinite period of time, and therefore there was always a jockeying for who was going to vie for leadership and putting together a timeline of how those things would work, because everyone being there would have different opportunities to serve as they moved up that ladder. With term limits, we're seeing a lot of these fights, for who's going to be the speaker 6 and 8 years down the line start before a lot of these guys get elected to the House. And really, it even starts very early in the Senate. And they line these leadership groups together very early on. And, in the last 4 years, Speaker Corcoran and Speaker Oliva changed some of the House rules to at least push back when the incoming class could select their leader that was going to eventually be the Speaker of the majority party. They moved it back to, they had to serve through their first session, so they couldn't make a vote until July 1 following their first session. And that was meant to kind of put the brakes on it a little bit, because what we had there for a little while was, as soon as the election happened, there was a rush in November and early December to lock up votes to who's going to be the presiding officer 6 years from that date. And a lot of these members, they had never served together. Some of them were new to the process. So it was really kind of who was more connected or who had more people that could help them get there. In the Senate, which was a much more collegial process, it's starting to also follow that same pattern of people starting, prior to them ever getting elected, trying to put together a coalition to be Senate president for a certain 2 years. And what that does is that kind of breaks up some of the power that the current leadership has for future leadership. But it definitely becomes a process where, and again, we've even seen where people have vied to become Speaker or Senate president. They've not been able to get the votes to win it during that period of time. And then they end up leaving office to go be a judge or go, run for local office or something else, because if they're not going to be the presiding officer and they're on the outs with the leadership team, it's very difficult for them to spend their time in the legislative process with minimal impact.
That's a good point. And you had really a ringside seat to this when you worked for Senate President Gates. You were involved with him from the minute he got elected, and were with him throughout his tenure of service up until he became the Senate president. So you have a real, I think, unique perspective. Can you share with us some insight into how much influence the presiding officers, the Senate president and the House Speaker, have on the process? We know, in most legislative bodies, it's top down. It seems like in Florida, that's probably like that, only on steroids. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, again, the Senate president and the Speaker of the House controls everything from committee chairmanships to committee assignments, to where, what office space you have, what parking space you have. They control the flow of all the bills. They control, which committees the bills are assigned to, and they control when a lot of those bills get up on the agenda. So again, a presiding officer in both the Senate and the House can control the process, pretty much from the top to the bottom. Now, the House is a little bit more militaristic, and it is totally driven from the top down, where the Speaker makes all of the decisions, right up until how some people actually get to vote on issues that are of very, very big importance to the chamber and to the leadership. The Senate is a little bit more collegial. There's a little bit more interaction. Obviously, major issues, big issues that affect the chamber, the presiding officer can push his members to support or oppose legislation. But also, there's a little bit more work in the process in the Senate on getting votes. than there is in the House. And a lot of that's just the makeup of the two bodies.
So what are some of the levers that, say, a Senate president might have to influence their colleagues to vote a certain way? Does the budget process have any role in some of these substantive legislative issues? And what I mean by that is, there a way that there's an intersection between a member's legislative member's budget priorities and maybe some of the substantive policy legislation that goes through?
Absolutely. When you need a key vote on issues that are very divisive, you want to hold on to every piece of legislation of substance to members until later in the process. The budget, part of the reason the budget waits to the last minute to get passed is it's a way to hold issues, budget priorities for members, to hold their votes and keep them in line to supporting leadership's priorities. So these are all tools that the Senate President and the Speaker use to hold members in line that are not inclined to support or oppose a position that's important to the presiding officer, but it's a way that you hold them in line. And obviously a presiding officer has their key leadership team that's going to be with them, and then they can go and sell another portion of the body to be with them. But then there's always going to be those people that are critical, on swing votes, that it takes every ounce of power for a presiding officer to hold on to, whether that be substantive legislation by the member or key budget priorities for that member that can and easily be taken out of the budget, in the final passage. And so it's all of the tools that are needed to corral everybody up and have them paddling in the same direction as the leader of the chamber.
Yeah, so you've really taken us behind the curtain, so to speak, and showed us how sometimes you might have an issue that you're advocating for, and if it gets caught up in the politics of the two presiding officers, you could end up in a situation where you lose on an issue and it doesn't have anything to do with the merits of the issue, and perhaps leverage is used to influence the process. And that's just, we're all big boys and girls, and we just have to understand that that's the nature of the process. So talking a little bit about the flow of legislation, you talk about how the Senate President and the Speaker, they control really what bills get heard, when they get heard, whether they make it to the floor. Tell us about how many bills on average are introduced in a typical legislative session, and how many bills on average, I know it varies from year to year, but how many actually pass the House and Senate and then go to the governor for his signature?
I would say on average, probably about 2,800 to 3,000 bills are filed every session. Obviously, sometimes they're a little bit more than that, a little bit less. But in recent years, the passage rate of bills that pass both the House and Senate and go to the governor is around 200 to 250. It's been about the average the last several sessions. Now, if you go back to the early 2000s, that number was up around 350 to 400. So it's definitely declined through the years. But some of that is a little bit more contentious between the chambers and the bodies. But again, it's really kind of weaned down to where there's only been about an average of 200 or so bills that have passed the last several years.
So how many of those are related to healthcare? And I don't want to put you on the spot here, and you may not know the answer, but what I'm trying to get at here is, the FMA's purpose really is to be the watchdog for the doctors. And, that's what you do. That's what the team that you've put together does. Tell us a little bit about how the FMA really is the watchdog for physicians and their patients in Tallahassee.
I'd say about 20 to 30% touch healthcare in some manner or fashion. So, anywhere from 30 to 40 bills that touch healthcare, whether it be mental health, hospital funding, different healthcare issues. But that's what I would say. So there's a portion of them that are dealing with healthcare in one way, shape, or another. But we track probably about 250 to 300 bills a session. And again, and some of those obviously are major bills that have major impact. Some are bills that have no impact. However, they could be amended to have impact. So there's some that we're watching. And as you move through session, that number slowly narrows of bills that are not being heard, bills that's never been heard in committee, bills that have 3, 4, 5 committee references, and there's only 2 more weeks of committee meetings, so they're less likely to be heard. So that list narrows as we move through. And also, bills get amended to broaden their title. So a bill that we may not have been watching through the first committee or even the second committee gets amended that then can be broadened out and be a vehicle for something that's either anti-physician or an opportunity for us to take advantage of. So we're always watching as bills move through the process. But again, as you slowly move through and in conversations with members, you kind of know that a bill that's been amended to change is or isn't going to include anything that's damaging to us. So we track those bills all the way through, but there's probably, of the 250 to 300 that we track every year, there's really probably 50 to 60 that are really viable bills that either have stuff in it we don't like or that we like, or they're amendable to be a vehicle for something we like or don't like. But it probably narrows down to that, a list of probably about 50 bills every session that we really, really focus on. And then we watch a lot of the other ones for any nefarious actions going on.
So of the 300 or so that are flagged that have some impact potentially on healthcare, these are bills that are actually introduced. Do we have somebody on our team that actually reads every single bill, or do we have a couple people that do that?
Absolutely. We've got a couple attorneys on staff, Jeff Scott and Mary Thomas, that do an amazing job of tracking every single one of those bills. They actually go through all the bills that are filed to narrow down to that list of 250 or 300. And then we continually watch those bills. They read every amendment that comes through. We even have some of the other folks that work with us that aren't attorneys that are going through those bills also that kind of say, hey, could this be a problem? So really, we have a lot of sets of eyes that are watching these bills. And again, and like I said, we kind of narrow them into bills that we're watching, and then the ones that are moving and that are really viable, and we kind of track those as we move through. But we watch and read every amendment that's filed, everything to see what kind of impact that it has. And as we capture those, any amendment or any language, if there's any question about how it affects specialty A or specialty B, we send it to the specialty lobbyist for them to take a look. If they have issues, we work with them on resolving those issues and getting that language back to the sponsor, because sometimes it's not an intentional issue that they've taken, it's an unintended consequence. And so again, that's why we stay on top of that stuff, because oftentimes something that comes out that would be very bad, in just 1 or 2 conversations with the legislator or their staff, we can get those things corrected and fixed because it was never the intent of the legislation. So we track a lot of that stuff.
So I want our physicians to kind of get a feel for what kind of a team that we have, doing this. I think that you have a team of about 6 in-house staff people that you oversee, including, you mentioned 2 attorneys, and you're also responsible for managing our contract lobbying team, which can consist of anywhere from 8 to 12 lobbyists that we have on contract, and that varies, year to year. But I'd say probably over the last decade or so, we've had between 8 and 12 lobbyists on contract. They don't work directly for the FMA. But they're contracted. So that's a team of almost 20 people that we have. That's a pretty big team. But how does that compare to other groups? And I'm thinking about the insurance industry, that sometimes we butt heads on issues, or the hospitals have a large contingent. How the business community, certainly. How does the FMA's team stack up in terms of numbers?
Well, I mean, we've got a great team internally and our external team, and it's roughly, like you said, about 20 people, both internal and external, and that's representing all physicians. And then we work with a lot of the other specialty societies that have their own lobbyists. So that may pick up another 10 or so lobbyists that work with a specific specialty that works in conjunction with us. But, compared to the insurance companies that, Blue Cross, Aetna, Cigna, Humana, they all will individually employ anywhere from 5 to 8 to 15 contract lobbyists and teams. And they also, they have an association that also employs, another probably 10 or 15 lobbyists. And so, we're always usually, a little bit smaller than most other groups. But again, following, the lead that you guys have put in place long before I got here 6 years ago, we've got a pretty nimble strike force, and we're able to kind of affect things and get things done, even though we fight a lot larger groups. And when you look at like even the insurance companies, they also have the Florida Chamber of Commerce and Associated Industries that work on their behalf because they're kind of their larger members. And so when we take on the business community, we're taking on, a large contingency of lobbyists, whether they be the business industry, the individual insurance, the insurance association. So, we fight a large group of people on those issues. And, but again, I think we've been very successful with, like I said, a nimble strike team that we have.
Yeah. So to kind of follow up on that, it's important to have coalitions, I guess. And you talked about the specialty societies, and about, I'd say, probably 12 or so specialty societies have their own, lobbyists. Tell me a little bit about, because I know this is a big part of what you do. Tell me a little bit about how the FMA works with the specialty societies to ensure that, medicine's voice is strong and unified to the greatest extent possible. Walk me through how you kind of corral this team of a dozen or so, in addition to our FMA team, and what goes into that.
Well, again, we meet with them once a week during the committee weeks and during session. And so we're able to kind of download with what we're working on and what's important to them, weekly, what they're hearing, what we're hearing. We really use them as an extension of our team. And again, for the most part, they are willing accomplices. They work with us. They help us gather information. They help us when we're seeking votes and working members for a committee vote. And so most all of them are very amenable to medicine. Obviously, whenever there's a disagreement between the specialties, it's something we try to help negotiate and resolve. But again, we view them as an extension of our team. We work very well with them. And like I said, a lot of it's just communication. We communicate with them constantly. We also, when we're dealing with a member or dealing with language, we're very good and proactive about making sure everyone and anyone that could possibly be impacted has an opportunity to look through the language and raise their issues with it. Then we kind of come to a collective agreement of going back to the member with the language. Because the last thing we need is for us to be saying something that maybe the dermatologists are saying something different, or some other specialty saying something different. So we really try to make sure that we're a unified voice in what we're saying when we're communicating with members, so they don't get mixed messages from the medical community.
Sure. Yeah.
Also,
that is difficult to manage. And sometimes we end up where there's issues where we have specialty societies that are on different sides of an issue, which really puts the FMA in a difficult spot. And I know you manage that really well. So, clearly you have, a tremendous responsibility. I think you do a fantastic job of managing the political capital of the FMA and juggling all the numerous issues impacting, Florida physicians. And like I said, it's not a perfect process. Sometimes there's going to be disappointments, and sometimes, we're going to have conflicts between physician groups. But for the most part, I think since you've been at the FMA, we've really presented a unified front, and I think you can be, really proud of that. So as we kind of wind this up, and this has been extremely informative, as we wind this up, Chris, what's the thing that you want physicians to know about the work that you do on their behalf? What's the one thing that sort of the takeaway message that you'd like physicians to be aware of?
Well, what I would say is probably the biggest takeaway that I would hope physicians would get about what we do here is, and it's much bigger than just me. We've got a great political team, and we've got a great legislative advocacy team, And really, we spend every day looking at how do we build relationships with legislators, how do we get involved in elections and get involved on the political side of it, how do we do everything that we can do to maximize physician success in this legislative process in the advocacy world. We're constantly looking at opportunities. We're constantly trying to figure out how to get more done. But again, we have a large team that we all put our heads together, and we're always looking for, whether it be a political opportunity in a special election, whether it be a primary in a key race that's going to lead to leadership, whether we're getting involved with somebody that's running for the House today, that we see them running for the Senate in 6 years or Congress in 8 years. You know, we're always looking for those opportunities of what can make our association stronger, where we can build more capital and turn that into wins for physicians and being able to get major legislative policy done, but also stopping bad legislative action.
Well, I know that I said that was going to be the last question, but you just said something that prompted another question. And, you know, I think that, you know, sometimes it's hard for people to understand that it really is a process. You know, it's not an event. It's not, you know, you don't come to Tallahassee and you show up at a committee meeting and you know, and that's it, and then it's done. It really is a process, and these issues carry over from year to year. And even though we have turnover in the legislative body, some of these ideas, you know, that we either are pushing for, advocating for, or things that we're against, you know, they sort of have a life of their own. So it's very important to not only take a short-term view of the process, but also a longer-term view. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just, and I think you just did, but, you know, yeah, we have to have a short-term view, but really this is a process. It's not a one-time event.
Absolutely. And again, that's where, you know, each election cycle is critical. And again, just like I talked earlier about leadership races, whenever you're doing things for an election cycle this year, that's where you're building a relationship for who could possibly be the speaker or the president from that class, or, you know, who's going to be in the leadership group, or who's going to look for other opportunities, whether they go to the other chamber or move up to Congress or even run statewide. So while there's always, every session we go into, what do we need to do this session to get things done and to avoid things from happening, we're always looking for next session, the following session, even up to like 6 and 8 years down the road to figure out where things are. Because again, the decisions we do today in helping certain races and elect certain people, those are going to be the people that are driving the chamber 6 years from now. And if we wait for 6 years to get engaged, it's too late. Because again, everybody's going to want to be friends at that point in time because it's easy and everybody knows what's going to happen. And that's why, again, everything we do now, just like with our physicians, having our physicians getting out, helping get people elected, helping, you know, introduce friends to them and potential voters that you know to them, helping them raise money, walking precincts, establishing those relationships. It's the easiest time to establish the strongest bonds you can have with those members. That again, when you look 6 years down the line, having done what you did 6 years ago builds that relationship with someone that's going to actually be making decisions in the Florida House and the Florida Senate.
I appreciate you. You really did link. I think what people have to understand is that elections have consequences, and there's a reason to get engaged in the political process, because the political process and the legislative process are really inextricably, you know, tied together in that way. So, you know, Chris, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your wealth of knowledge and teaching us a little bit about how the legislative process in Florida works. I don't think anyone can question your dedication, and every doctor really in the state of Florida owes you a debt of gratitude for having their back and for fighting for them in Tallahassee. So I want to thank you for that. And, you know, I want our members to know that Chris is accessible to you anytime. If you have any questions about the process, how things work, Chris is only a phone call away, an email away, and he's very interested in hearing from you. So don't hesitate. And again, thank you, Chris, for joining us. This has been a great discussion.
Thanks so much for having me, man. I enjoyed it, and I enjoy the opportunity of what I get to do every day.
You got it.
Thanks, man.
Florida Medical Association, helping physicians practice medicine.